Hello, everyone. Now I would like to talk about the way I learned my languages and how I proceeded. In the beginning, it should be mentioned that each person is different. Each person has different preferences, different abilities, different strengths and weaknesses, and so on. So it's natural that everyone actually tends to learn languages differently. Everyone prefers different activities and different things to do. Someone likes talking, someone likes watching movies, someone prefers studying explicitly, someone likes reading books, someone likes playing games, and so on and so on. Thus, everyone has to find their own way of learning, something that works best for him or her, and therefore, what I'm going to describe now is my specific way of learning that I used and that somehow worked for me. So, it's not surprising that, as far as I've noticed, my approach was kind of different than that of most of the people that I know. So, what worked for me, or seems to have worked for me somehow, or how I proceeded? Well, this will be described during the following few minutes. I started like this. Some languages I learned at school, so that part I will not be discussing now. Yeah, for those I learned there the basics and acquired a strong foundation, maybe, especially in case of English. But what I'll focus on will be the languages which I learned on my own, like Spanish, French, and many more languages later on. As for the first languages that I learned on my own, the first language which I learned on my own outside school was Spanish. I started learning by buying a textbook, and in this way, my personal approach started developing. Like, I usually buy a textbook, usually a kind of textbook that contains basically everything in the language. Usually textbooks for autodidacts, for people who learn without a teacher, are best for this purpose. And I learn from there systematically. Usually such textbooks have a certain number of units or lessons. More or less, this tends to be around 30. Some of them can have like 15, or some of them maybe even 50, but usually it's close to 30, which suggested my time framework for my initial study of each language. Because 1 month is around 30 days, so normally I studied one such lesson per day, and it took me about a month to go through one language in this way. So, this idea of organizing my language study into specific sections done per day was used or started for the first time with Spanish. And thus, with this language, I started studying some predetermined part of the Spanish lesson from my textbook every day. Or, for the sake of speed, with other languages, the whole lesson, depending on the size or length of my materials for the given language. So, with Spanish, I proceeded like this for about 2 months. And basically, after going through the whole textbook, I had an idea about practically everything that Spanish has. All grammatical structures, basic vocabulary, and so on. Soon after that, I don't quite remember how exactly, but it was similar. I did something very similar with French, which was my following language. As far as I remember, it followed shortly after this, maybe within a year or within a few months after Spanish. I don't quite remember, but with different intensity, and I was probably somehow distracted. I couldn't like mentally get it so well into my head like I had done with Spanish, so that it would stick better for later. But still, it was my solid introduction into French at that time, or my basis for French. I don't know whether I did the whole lesson or parts of the lesson during one day with French. It's not that important. And then, after a few years, when I started doing something similar with other languages, I realized, okay, this has somehow worked for me with Spanish. Back then with Spanish, I had like 2 months of free time, which was quite a lot of time. I could go slowly. I could learn the language more or less quite well. I actually didn't quite know what I was doing at that time. So now, after a few years, when I started some other languages like Greek, Italian, and so on, I realized, well, doing only part of a lesson would probably not keep the momentum, because my textbooks for these two languages contained like, I don't know specifically, but maybe between 30 and 40 lessons or units. And I was like, well, now I need to do it faster because I would like to focus on other things as well, apart from language learning. I said to myself, I have this experience with Spanish, so I'll try it in a similar way, only faster, with another language. And so I started. I remember writing in my calendar something like, let's call it micro deadlines, like how many days were remaining, how many units were remaining, and the target dates for the individual lessons and for the whole textbook. And this collection of these micro deadlines in the form of a countdown written down manually in my calendar was something like my study plan. And this was also how I proceeded with the following couple of languages. Gradually, I started learning another language. I don't know, probably it was Greek. So I've gone through this language in a similar manner. And I was like, okay, Greek, maybe a bit different type of a language than I had been learning before that. Different script. It's not a Romance language. It's not a Germanic language. It's not even a Slavic language, unlike those that I had learned before. So it had much less in common with the languages that I had already studied before. And in this situation, I set out on a journey to learn it. I studied one lesson per day. It was quite intensive. The textbook for Greek was quite detailed and long, and well, it worked out somehow. And gradually, more and more, I was getting a feeling I could understand things in Greek. I could express some things, maybe not ideally, but I could. I usually don't focus on writing that much when learning languages, but with Greek, I paid more attention to it because this language uses a different script. So I was definitely also practicing by doing my exercises in written form as well, even if that wasn't necessarily my main focus. So this is basically how I learned my first languages. And in this way, I developed this, let's call it one lesson per day approach. And with all other languages that followed, I continued in a similar way. And thus, when later I started learning even more languages, this was the way I did it with all of them. I got a textbook, a hard copy, no electronic versions, no PDFs. This doesn't work for me, because when I'm focusing on the screen, there are too many distractions there. And I have to say that learning this way was quite possible for me at that time, because back then there was much less distraction by the internet, by phones, and so on. So at that time, it was easier. I started shortly before I got my first smartphone and a constant internet connection. So, as I already said, later I did this with practically all of the languages that I was interested in. The situation was a bit different with languages like Chinese, Japanese, or Arabic, where their writing system presented additional challenges. This brought me to the conclusion that in order to make best use of my time and possible results based on the time necessary for these languages and their usability for me, I can't focus on them too much, and as a result, I did not learn those languages to a satisfactory level. Satisfactory for me, of course. However, what presented the biggest challenge for me was the maintenance of all the languages that I was learning. I used to use each of them every day, doing something in them for at least a few minutes in order to practice them. But as their number kept growing, I had to split them in 2 days, and later I started skipping some of them for longer time, and I had to periodically refresh their knowledge by explicit study again and again after some time. And now I ended up focusing on the languages that are the most important for me, and the remaining ones I use just occasionally. Thank you very much for watching. If you want, you can share your own language learning experience in the comments, and see you again next time. Goodbye.